It is found in Mark chapter 14, and it's skipping all over in verses, so you can follow along on the screen if you would like to. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all of the chief priests and elders and the scribes were assembled. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. But he was silent and did not answer. And again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. But again he denied it. Then after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter broke down and wept. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, as we concluded worship last week, we found ourselves in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas had just betrayed Jesus with a kiss. The disciples had fled, and Jesus was placed under arrest. So this morning finds us in the very early hours of Friday morning. Jesus and his captors had to walk the mile between Gethsemane and the house of Caiaphas, who was the high priest. And the picture, these are the steps that Jesus would have taken. Peter and John had somehow mustered up enough courage to follow Jesus and his captors at a safe distance. Let's go ahead and go to the next picture if you can, camera. Up to Caiaphas's house. Now, once Jesus was in custody, the Sanhedrin, who were the Jewish ruling council, would have been hastily called to the grand hall of the house. Below the ground on the site where Caiaphas' house believes to have stood is a pit. Think of it as an early holding cell. This would have been the place when Jesus arrived at Caiaphas' house, that he would have been lowered down into the ground with ropes and held there until the Sanhedrin had all assembled. It also is where he would have been taken after his conviction. The Sanhedrin were 71 elders of the Jewish committee. They were a council that were considered to be the wisest and the most pious men of the time. They had control of the temple and the religious courts, and they were men who theoretically devoted themselves to God. And the high priest of the council, Caiaphas, was the leading religious figure at the time. Now, usually the election of the high priest was an internal matter. Think of it kind of as like a first century conclave where they got together and they decided who was going to be their leader. But unfortunately, at this point in time, the office had become corrupt. And instead of being chosen by the Jewish community, the high priest was appointed by the Roman government, the Roman officials. This was done for a number of reasons, most notably because the Roman government needed the help of the high priest to keep all of these Israelites under control. Caiaphas was a puppet ruler. Now, as I mentioned, it's very early Friday morning, the middle of the night, and the Sanhedrin did not usually meet in the middle of the night, and they most definitely didn't meet during religious festivals. Remember, it was Passover. Earlier Thursday night, Jesus had celebrated the Seder with his disciples. So the fact that the Sanhedrin were all there, ready to convene at a moment's notice, shows the unorthodox way that this trial of Jesus was being handled. It also shows the urgency and the secrecy that they felt was needed to be able to deal with this Jesus fellow. One thing that's important to take note of: Jesus, God in the flesh, came and walked among us on earth. He came with no great splendor, born in a cattle stall, in this little town of Bethlehem that had no great significance at the time. He entered his ministry with no great fanfare. There were no trumpets. There was no royal treatments. He came as one of us, and he healed the sick, and he forgave sinners, and he showed compassion to the lost, and he taught people what God was really like. It wasn't the sinners that arrested Jesus. It was the most holy, the most pious, the most religious people. The people who should have been the most likely ones to see Jesus for who he truly was, the Son of God, the Messiah. They are the ones who put Jesus on trial for blasphemy. Why? To understand why, we have to understand the purpose of the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We have to understand what their role was supposed to be and what their job ended up being. The job of the religious leaders at the time was to help people maintain their relationship with God. They were supposed to help them learn more about God. These were people who were educated in Torah, the Mosaic law, the law that the Israelites had followed for thousands of years. Now, with this position came a certain amount of status, a certain amount of power. And so what the religious leaders were supposed to do is not what they ended up doing. They used their knowledge of the law to condemn people, to discriminate against them rather than help them. Whenever you read a story about Jesus and you read the words, "He is a sinner," "She is a sinful woman," "This person is unclean," it's most likely going to be a religious person, a religious leader saying this. Instead of helping people become unclean. Instead of helping them learn to follow God more closely, they said, "You're a sinner. Get away from me." And then along comes this Jesus character. And he's forgiving people of their sins. Wait a minute. That's my job to forgive them of their sins. That's my job to accept their sacrifice, to make the blood atonement on their behalf. Who is this Jesus telling them that they're forgiven and they don't have to do all of this stuff? Here comes this Jesus who has just as much knowledge of the law as they do. Well, he should. He wrote it. But wait a minute. That's my job to tell you that you are breaking the law. That's my job to tell you how this law is supposed to be interpreted. Here comes this Jesus who heals the sick, who causes the lame to walk, who causes the deaf to hear, who causes the blind to see. Wait a minute, we can't do that. Here comes this Jesus who brings the dead back to life. Now the religious leaders are really scared. They were so scared. They were so concerned that their power, that their authority was going to be stripped by this Jesus, that they had to do something about him. Every time they tried to trip Jesus up, every time they tried to trick him with questions about the law, they failed. And every time Jesus put them in their place, every time Jesus told them what they were doing wrong, every time Jesus says, "You still don't get it? You're supposed to be the people who know this inside and out, and you don't have a clue." Every time he did something like that to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, their anger rose. And so did their fear. Now, it's easy for us to relate to fear. It's a human condition. We are born with this instinct, and it serves a purpose. It's an emotion that is given to us to help protect ourselves. Self-preservation, fight or flight. But when we combine that emotion, when we combine that need for self-preservation with our bent toward sinning, with our human nature, we can have a problem. Our self-preservation ceases to be about keeping ourselves safe, and it starts to become our mechanism to keep ourselves above all others. Fear can be a motivator, and it's very easy to use. In the midst of this political campaign season, how often are we seeing fear being used to try and gain votes? Across the board. I'm not going political party on you here. Just across the board. How many times do we hear the message, "Our country is going to hell in a handbasket. Elect me and I'll stop it from happening"? That's fear used as a motivator. The question that we have to ask ourselves as Christians is not what will make me feel most secure, but rather, what is the most loving thing for me to do? That was Christ's message all along. Love your neighbors. What is the greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like this: love your neighbors as yourself. The only thing that will truly conquer fear and hate is love. Now, out of these 71 men that made up the Sanhedrin, surely a few of them must have questioned whether putting Jesus to death was the right thing to do. Well, we're only told of one who disagreed. Joseph of Arimathea. Remember that name, we're going to need it in a couple weeks. Joseph of Arimathea. But even though he disagreed, no one spoke up. Fear had solidified these men together for a purpose. Let's take a look at the trial of Jesus. We were told that the Sanhedrin were looking for people who could testify against Jesus, who could say, yes, I saw him do something wrong. Now, according to Jewish law, 2 witnesses had to agree in their testimony in order to be able to convict. They could find no agreement between all the witnesses that they brought in. They could find nothing to condemn Christ on. So finally, Caiaphas asks Christ, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus could have remained silent. We have that law against self-incrimination. Jesus could have stood there and said absolutely nothing, and they would have had no grounds for conviction. But instead, Jesus answered, "I am." Now, those 2 short words, although they don't seem to be, are actually quite profound. He could have said, "Yes, I am the Messiah. Yes, I am he." Instead, he said, "Just, I am." 1,200 years earlier, when Moses stood before a burning bush that was not consumed and heard a voice, he asked, "Who is this?" And he got the name of God. He was told, "I am who I am." So when Jesus spoke those words, "I am," he's not just answering in the first person, confirming a suspicion that Caiaphas had. He's using a personal name of God. He's drawing a direct line between himself and God. He's showing people that he wasn't just simply a wonderful teacher. He wasn't simply a wonder worker. He was also showing that he wasn't this military Messiah that they were hoping for. Instead, he was telling people that he is indeed God. That's all that was needed. Jesus stood convicted of blasphemy. Now, while all of this was going on in Caiaphas' house, there was another drama going on outside, that of Peter. Now remember, we heard last week that Peter promised Jesus that he would die with him rather than abandon him, rather than deny him. When Jesus was arrested, Peter drew his sword and chopped off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. Although his actions were misguided there, Peter showed great courage when he was trying to fight on behalf of his master. We tend to forget that courage in that moment when we hear the story of Peter denying Christ and then hearing the rooster crow. It took great courage for Peter to follow, even at a distance, Jesus and his captors. And it took greater courage to walk into that courtyard to see if he could get an idea of what was going on. But that courage only lasted until he was confronted himself. The first time that little servant girl, "Hey, you were with Jesus," he lost it. No, I wasn't. The third time that he denies Jesus, the Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus looked from inside the hall out at Peter. This particular story of Peter denying Christ is found in all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That must be a pretty important story if all four of them included it. It probably wasn't included to embarrass Peter. The Gospels were written long after Peter had been martyred for his faith. Maybe it was something that they had all heard about Peter. Maybe he had shared it himself, the time that he had denied Christ. For us today, there's lots of ways to deny Christ. When we speak in ways that aren't keeping with his will, when we act with contempt towards others, when we put ourselves before others, when we worry more about what others think about us rather than what God thinks about us, when we regard ourselves as less than worthy. Listen to that one again. When we regard ourselves as less than worthy, undeserving of God's love, undeserving of his grace. When we do something wrong because other people are telling us to do it. These are all ways that we can deny Christ. Maybe the fact that this particular story is found in all four of the Gospels is because it's a way to reassure us. It's a way to remind us that despite the fact that there are times that we are all going to deny Jesus, Jesus will still take us back. It doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter what we've said. It doesn't matter what we've thought. It doesn't matter how often we deny Christ. God will take us back. That is what the cross is all about. There is nothing that we have ever done. There's nothing that we will ever do that God will abandon us for. His unconditional love is always there. We just have to believe in it, to reach out and to take his hand. Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And with those words, the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, condemned Jesus to death. There's just one problem. They don't have the authority to kill him. They needed Pilate. That's where we will find ourselves next week. Amen.